Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Peah, chapter 7, Halacha 1, and this chapter is going to deal with trees, things dealing with trees. So this chapter is going to talk about shkikha specifically for trees. Mishnah says, any olive tree that has a name in the field as a distinctive, extraordinary tree, even if it is known as an olive tree that drips oil in its time, if the owner forgot to harvest it, it is not subject to the law of shkikha. Wow, imagine oil trees, olive trees that are so rich that they drip olive oil. So that is something that's memorable. I mean, an olive tree that drips oil is a memorable thing. And if you're leaving something from that tree that's next to it, that because it's distinctive, it's not going to be subject to shikha because it's so memorable that you're eventually going to come to remember it. You're going to be walking around. You're going to say, oh, I have this tree that's so rich that olive oil drips from the tree itself. And if you start harvesting piles of olives there and you go and you forget about it, you're going to say, oh, what about that tree? It's the only one I have in the field that actually is so rich it drips olive oil. And then you're going to come to remember it. That's what it's trying to show us, is that things that are so distinctive that it causes us to eventually remember it. And the point is that it's trying to show this principle for all types of shkikha. In the view of the Yerushalmi, it's talking about an olive tree, okay, but this could be applied to other trees as well, and we should try to look at it in terms of the Yerushalmi's view that this is like a hekesh, where it's not just olive trees, it's any kind of tree that would be distinctive. Let's say you had a grapevine that produced extra large grapes for whatever reason, and it was just and extra productive. So it's trying to show that that all the species of fruit trees are going to be subject to shkikha like this. Okay, that it's trying to show that it's trying to single out the olive tree because there's a ruling that comes up in this Mishnah by Rabbi Yossi, and that's going to talk about olive trees, but you shouldn't read it right here as only for olive trees. The point is that you have something that's so distinctive about this tree, maybe in terms of productivity, that it's eventually going to cause you to be remembering it. So the Mishnah is going to explain that, and Mishnah says, when are these words said? When a tree's reputation can exempt its fruit from the laws of shkikha, when it is distinctive in its name, in its productivity, or its location. So again, Yerushalmi's view is going to be that it's going to be any particular kind of tree, not just an olive tree, and it can be singled out by having a specific name, or it's going to be unusually productive, or even it could be next to a landmark. Okay, so because it's next to a landmark, you're eventually going to remember it. And an olive tree that's going to be known to people for any of these features, or some other kind of tree as well, is not going to be subject to shkikha. You could have a carob tree that also could have features like this. Extra nice carobs. These carobs in this carob tree, for whatever reason, doesn't get wormy. That's something to remember it by. So this is something that makes it distinctive. So it won't be shkikha because eventually you'll come to remember it. Now, Mishnah continues, says, being distinctive in its name means that this tree is known as shevchani or a baishani. In other words, the unusual characteristic is going to be explained in the Gemara, but basically it's going to be based on the word like shefa. It's going to have like a lot of shefa, or by shan, like shame. It's like shame because it doesn't produce a lot. Okay, so Mishnah reads, in its productivity means that it produces a lot, and in its location means that it stands alongside a wine press or a break in the wall. In other words, it's not necessarily only these two that are in the Mishnah. It's trying to point out something that's permanent, right? So in Derech Hamuna, chapter 5, 145, it's saying that in the case of the distinctiveness of the tree, it lies in proximity to a particular landmark. For instance, he says, an olive tree standing next to a wine press or break in the wall would be identified as the tree next to the press or the tree near the gap. And this, by the way, is talking about not just those two kinds of landmarks, but any kind of landmark. And it's generally going to be a permanent type of feature. It's not going to be a temporary feature like a grain stack that you can move, 3 days from now. It's talking about something that's really fixed into place that has this long-standing, thing. Season after season, it's still next to that wall with a gap. Season after season, it's still next to the wine press. So that's going to effectively create this status where it becomes distinctive. So the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, but with regards to all other olive trees, this is the law. 2 trees that were forgotten are shchicha, but 3 trees that were forgotten are not shchicha. So this is similar to what we were talking about with harvest and things in a row. And the dissenting view is that Rabbi Yossi says there is no shchicha for olive trees. Now, the Gemara is going to explain Rabbi Yossi's reasoning, and this is going to be one of those cases where you can't look at the Mishnah and say, oh, this is the halacha. Rabbi Yossi says there's no shchicha for olive trees. There's no shchicha for olive trees, regardless of whether it's distinctive or not distinctive. This is going to come up with a case that if you do not have the tradition, you're not going to understand what this Mishnah means. Okay, Rabbi Yossi is talking about a little period of time in history that applied to olive trees just for a brief time in Eretz Yisrael and is not applicable for other times. It's going to be really interesting on what Rabbi Yossi means, but this is a key point here with what Rabbi Yossi says for why you can't poskin off of Mishnayot, why it's a terrible sin to do it, because you have to have the whole picture. You need the Gemara to fill it in. And we're going to get into that later. One quick point to keep in mind before we get into this Gemara. Right now, we're talking about the Tana Rabbi Yossi. And in the Gemara, we're going to be talking about an Amara Rabbi Yossi, has the same name, and you really need the tradition and the Meforshim to understand which is which. The Yerushalmi is not going to spell it out for you, so you have to look at the arguments in order to understand which Rabbi Yossi is talking. Here in this Mishnah, we're talking about a Rabbi Yossi, the Tana, who is talking about olive trees. Now, we're going to look at one of the other Amorim who's going to have an opinion that this is talking about a historical event. And then the Amora, Rabbi Yossi, is going to be talking about an opinion that he has from a tradition that he has from his rabbi on a Gezerah Shava that the other rabbis don't have and don't accept. They didn't hear this Gezerah Shava, and they don't hold that. They don't hold the Amora Rabbi Yossi's that his Gezerah Shava is correct. Now, keep in mind that we always have to have a tradition for a Gezerah Shava. We can't make up a Gezerah Shava on our own. Now, I don't want you to think that this Amora made up a Gezerah Shava. He didn't. He had a tradition, and he got it from his rabbi, but it's not going to be accepted. So I'm going to point out to you from the Vilna Goan where the text is going to be showing which Rabbi Yossi is talking. And in the end, I want to sum up about why it's so dangerous to come make up Gezerah Shavas on your own, and why you really have to stick to the tradition. And, these new modern readings where you're trying to shoehorn things in from the modern orthodoxy or all sorts of other types of ways to read it that are different from the tradition, that you really have to stay away from it. Now, I'm not accusing the Amorah of doing that. He had a tradition. But I am saying that we have to be careful not to make up our own stuff. And we have to be careful that we really stick to the tradition, really stick to the Meforshim, we really stick to the guys like Rashi and the Vilna Goan and the Rambam, and really look at these guys to understand what's going on step by step to help us to explain each Gezerah Shava and each thing, because they have a tradition, they're passing it on to us. So please do not think that I'm saying that this Amorah is making it up. He's not. But there are a lot of other people who do make up Gezerah Shavas and do make up a lot of Torah, and we have to stay away from those kinds of people. Thank you. So the Mishnah is ruling that an olive tree that is distinctive in some way is going to be exempt from shchicha. The Gemara is going to provide the source of this ruling. Rabbi Law said, it is written in the verse that teaches the law of shchicha, which is in Beurim 24:19. It says, when you reap your harvest in your field and you forgot a sheaf in the field, do not return to take it. The words, and you forget, implies that the law of shchicha applies only to a sheaf that you will forget forever once it has been overlooked, says the Gemara. And the Gemara continues, it says, excluded in this case is a distinctive tree, which you will remember afterward because of its unusual features. In other words, says the Mara Fulda, he's saying that this unqualified phrase in the Torah, and you forget, implies a permanent forgetting. And this is going to come to exclude a plant that is especially memorable for some reason, such as an olive tree that literally is so rich it drips olive oil. That is certainly memorable. I've never seen that, but I would love to see it, and I would definitely remember such a tree. Such a tree must have existed, or there must be such kinds of trees, because they wouldn't mention it otherwise. The Rosh Cirilio is going to explain it a little bit differently, and he's going to say that in order to violate this prohibition, one must recall the forgotten sheaf and return to take it. Thus, the verse could have stated that when a person remembers a forgotten sheaf, he shall not return to collect it. And by focusing on the act of forgetting, the verse implies that the prohibition applies only to a sheaf that is truly forgotten, meaning that one will likely remain forgotten forever, and this excludes a sheaf or tree that is rendered memorable on account of some distinctive feature. Now, the Gemara is going to come and give a question regarding this exemption for distinctive trees. And it's going to ask a question with a series of related rulings. So here's the first ruling. Gemara says, Rabbi Yerushalmi said, if a tree was distinctive in the owner's mind only, it is regarded as if it were distinctive in reality, and therefore it is not subject to the law of shchicha. So that's a really interesting idea. Here's what the Mara Fulda says, and by the way, you can look at the halacha on this by the Rambam in Matanos Aniyim, chapter 5, halacha 4. Mara Fulda says like this, says, this Gemara is referring to a tree that possesses none of the special characteristics mentioned in the Mishnah, or inherent specialty like dripping oil, but is nonetheless viewed by its owner as something unique and distinctive. I can imagine an example of this. There's a beautiful tree for kumquats that's in front of my neighbor's house here in Harnof, and the tree is large and it's beautiful and the fruits are beautiful. And when you walk into my neighbor's house, that you have this one tree. I mean, it's probably like every other kumquat tree, but it is glorious and beautiful, and the fruit is delicious, and it is memorable. It might be like every other one, but that's the only one that's there. And so that would satisfy that case. It's not distinctive. I mean, these kumquats are not the size of a fist. They're not abnormally large. They're not abnormally delicious. They're delicious, but not abnormally delicious. So this is another way to try to understand this point. Mara Fulda continues. He says that Rabbi Yermia rules that because the tree is distinctive in the owner's eyes, it is excluded from the law of shkichaka. And by the way, that resonates with the Mara Fulda's first ruling that we just talked about. And the Gemara, it could refer to a tree that does possess one of the characteristics in the Mishnah, but whose special characteristic is not yet known to the general public. That's another way to read it. And Rabbi Yermia rules that although its distinctiveness is known only to the owner, there is no shkicha for the tree. If that tree in front of my neighbor's house was a carob tree and had delicious carobs, and there's only one carob tree there on the block, and there's no other carob trees anywhere else in the area, but that carob tree is no different than any other carob tree, it's just the only one there, well, that would satisfy what Rabbi Yermia is talking about. If my neighbor were to take this mythical carob tree that's the only one in front of his house instead of the kumquat tree and take down the fruits and try to start making piles so he can come and bring it in and save them and eat them over the year with his kids, then certainly this would be something that is distinctive in the owner's mind, and certainly it's the only one that's there. And then you would say that, oh, well, this is not going to be subject to shkicha. This is talking about trees out in a field in generality. And so that if you have lots and lots and lots of fields of trees, and maybe one of them hasn't drips oil, but it's not known to be famous for dripping oil, then that could be something that is distinctive. There are other trees here in Israel that some of them are over 1,000 years old and they still produce olives. That's distinctive. That's a case of a distinctive tree. Now, if I were an average person, I wouldn't know that it's 1,000-year-old olive tree, but the owner would. And maybe he didn't publicize that it's 1,000-year-old olive tree that's still making olives and olive oil. But that tree in that kind of case, if it was out in a grove, that would be distinctive in the owner's mind, and that would not be subject to shkichucha. So those are some examples of it. A second ruling, Gemara says, if an ordinary tree was standing beside a date palm, the date palm lends it distinctiveness. Therefore, it is not subject to the law of shkichucha. So the Rosh Cirilio says, and he explains this, that Rabbi Yermia rules that the proximity to a tree of another type is sufficient to render an olive tree exempt from shkichucha. Just as an olive tree located next to a wine press or break in the wall is distinctive and thus exempt from shkichucha, so too an olive tree located alongside a date palm, in other words, this other type of tree, that's going to be distinctive. The Derech Hamuna is pointing out that only when the neighboring tree is a date palm, and that's because this tree is also going to be fruit bearing. They're both fruit bearing, and the date palm is going to be beautiful and tall, and that is going to render its neighbor distinctive. And trees do not possess these trees that do not possess these characteristics, however, do not cause their neighboring trees to be exempt from shkichucha. So this is talking about, says the Vilna Goan, a specific type of tree that's a fruit-bearing tree that's next to another fruit-bearing tree, and that this fruit-bearing tree has to be beautiful, tall, and also fruit-bearing, and these three characteristics are going to create this distinctiveness next to this olive tree or carob tree. Third ruling. Gemara says, if two olive trees adjacent to one another were trees that drip oil, this one lends distinctiveness to that one, and that one lends distinctiveness to this one. Therefore, neither is subject to the law of shkichucha. So the Mara Fulda is going to explain that Rabbi Yermia's case is where A person began harvesting the olives on these trees, and then, before completing the task, moved on to the other tree and forgot about these two, or onto other trees. In other words, you have two olive trees that are so unusual and rich, they literally drip olive oil. And they go off to a third olive tree and they start harvesting the third olive tree, but the third olive tree is not distinctive. It's a regular olive tree. It's not one of these amazing olive trees. So, ordinarily, the olives that remain on the tree whose harvest had begun are going to be subject to the law of shchicha, even if it's a distinctive tree, because the owner will remember the harvest he began and assume he completed it. Rabbi Yermia is ruling that where you have two distinctive trees that are located next to each other, then even if the owner has already begun to harvest it, there's no shchicha, for the owner is likely to recall the unusual sight of two distinctive trees growing side by side. Alternatively, it could be read where the Gemara is speaking of a case in which one of the trees no longer drips oil, and it was the Gemara is going to use a term to say netofa, which is like, or natofa, which is like something that's dripping and something that's like unusual. It's trying to use this term to show that it's something that's has this unusual characteristic and that it was this unusual thing, and now it became not unusual. It's like a normal one, and that it's still going to be exempt. So that could be another reading of it. And now the Gemara is going to pose a question. It's going to say, if all the trees in one's field dripped oil, and the person forgets to harvest some of them, are they shchicha or not? So the Rosh Cirilio points out that this inquiry is not limited to a case in which one forgot two trees, but applies to where one forgets a single natofa tree, one of these unusual trees that consists of entirely these types of trees. So one could argue that a single tree among many is not particularly special or memorable, and so it should be subject to shchicha, but the excessive oil content of a natofa makes it memorable even when there's only one of many such trees. In other words, each of these kinds of trees is memorable. And the Gemara is going to answer this question. It's going to say, let us learn the answer from this question from the teaching of Rabbi Shimon bar Yakim. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Yossi says, there is no shchicha for olive trees. And Rabbi Shimon bar Yakim said, with regards to this ruling, Rabbi Yossi said this only in the beginning when olive trees were not common. For Hadrian the Wicked came and laid waste to the entire land. So in the history of the Middle East, the reason that you have such a reliance on olive trees, and by the way, in all rocky areas, if you look around the Mediterranean, in rocky areas and hilly areas in Greece, in Turkey, in Lebanon and Israel, certainly over in Spain and in Morocco, you have these very dry areas, and it's rocky and hilly, and it's very hard to get any kind of economy of scale from farming in terms of putting out huge wheat fields. You have wheat fields in Israel, but those are in the lowlands. Keep in mind that the geography of the country and the halacha is divided into three parts of the land. Okay, and the part of the land where you're going to be growing a lot of wheat and barley, that's going to be down in the lower section of the land. Now, around Jerusalem, it's very hilly, it's very dry, and it takes very, very well to olives. Now, it's rocky, so you can't really plow a rocky field. It's very hard to do. You have giant boulders, you can't move it, right? There's boulders everywhere. So the problem is that how do you get enough calories to support your society and your civilization if you have rocky terrain that's hilly and you can't really plow it? So what the ancients did was they relied on olive groves. An olive grove will take around 15 years to grow and to mature to where they produce enough olive oil that it makes it worthwhile. And people can go and harvest olives by walking around these big boulders from tree to tree. You don't need animals and cows and tools to pull a plow. People will go walk between these boulders and hills and collect them one tree at a time. And it has created enough calorie count between the food olives and the oil olives to support ancient societies in the Middle East, Turkey, Greece, and elsewhere. And so it's really a key thing for these kinds of societies with this kind of terrain. Now, Hadrian, the Roman emperor, the Caesar there, wanted to punish the Jews. And what did they do? The first thing they came and they did was they axed down all of the olive groves and the olive trees. Why would they do that? They're trying to pressure the Jews into submission. They're trying to make the Jews so poor that they would sell themselves into slavery. And they're trying to do it where they're going to subjugate the people by taking away the traditional food crop. So that's why Rabbi Yossi says that olive trees were not common, because this was a state-run project by the empire to totally deforest the land of Israel from olive trees. And that's why if you had an olive tree, it would be very unusual and very memorable, and why it would not be at this period of time subject to shkika, because it was so unusual that this state project of the Roman Empire would have missed an olive tree. Surely they did, right? Surely they would have missed some trees, but those trees would not be subject to shkika because they're very memorable and they're unusual. It's like, oh, this olive tree is over there. The Roman Empire forgot to cut it down. So you're going to remember that. And if you have piles of olives that you went and took, eventually you're going to remember those piles because there's not a lot of olive trees in the country. And that's why you can't really rule off of, you can't paskin off of the Mishnah. This Mishnah says that Rabbi Yossi says there's no shkika off of olive trees. Now you would look at it, if you didn't know this story, you didn't know the tradition, you didn't know this Gemara, you would look at it and you would say, oh, Rabbi Yossi has this point that for whatever reason he's interpreting it that there's no shkika at all on olive trees. And what he's saying is, no, it's just this period of time. And in this period of time, there is no shkika on olive trees because it's an unusual period of time where the Roman Empire basically turned every olive tree into a distinctive olive tree. That is the point. Gemara continues, it says, but now that the olive trees are common, even Rabbi Yossi agrees, there is no shkika for olive trees. So basically, now that the Roman Empire changed Caesars and they started to let the Jews replant these olive groves, now it's not so distinctive anymore. So everybody agrees that they will be subject to shkika. But this is a key point that's trying to teach us that, hey, if any of these trees has some characteristic of unusual distinctiveness, that is going to be a qualifier because it's not like every other tree in an orchard. That's really the point. So according to Rabbi Shimon bar Yakim, okay, the dispute between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yossi is only about olive trees during this period of time when the olive trees were scarce. Because the trees were scarce, their status is going to be that of a distinctive tree. And the Tanna Kama is going to rule that during this period of time, the olive trees were subject to shkika. And we see that even when an entire field consists of distinctive trees, like trees that drip oil, the trees are going to be subject to shkika. Now, that's a big hiddush, because if you had just one tree, you'd say, well, why is it that one tree should be exempt? But if you have a field of all of these trees are like this, that there should be shkika. That's a very big hiddush by the Tanna Kama. And that's the point of the dispute between Rabbi Yossi and the Tanna Kama. The Tanna Kama are saying, hey, if all of the trees are like this in this unusual thing, in this unusual case, then, and in this unusual case, they all drip olive oil, that's how rich they are, then they're going to be subject to the laws of shkika. I want to point out a comment by the Mara Fulda to help us understand this. So the Gemara's proof is not from the Tanna Kama, but from Rabbi Yossi. And his ruling demonstrates that the distinctiveness of trees is assessed according to their availability. Thus, just as ordinary trees are deemed distinctive when they are scarce, and ordinary when common, so too with special trees such that drip olive oil, that it follows that in a field full of trees that drip olive oil, none are regarded as distinctive. Therefore, they are subject to shkika when overlooked. So that's a deep insight that the Tanna Kama has, that, in other words, these are all such good trees and the whole field is filled with them, that they're all going to be subject to shkika. Now, the Mishnah is going to move on to this thing of distinctiveness in name. Okay, so the Mishnah said shafoni, and shafoni is, it's like from shefa. It's like literally something that pours. Okay, so the Gemara is going to explain the use of this term with respect to olive trees, and it's going to say shafoni, and the Gemara says means that the tree drips and pours oil. In other words, the fruit is so rich that olive oil is literally going to drip from the oils when they are still standing on the tree. That's what it says. And a tree that possesses this really unusual, distinctive characteristic, certainly if it's by itself, is going to be exempt from the law of shkika, because it's eventually going to be remembered. You're going to remember such a tree. And the Gemara is going to question this explanation. Okay, so the Gemara says, but the Mishnah has already taught us that a tree that drips olive oil, in other words, it's going to use this term again, natofa, is exempt from shkika, and therefore the term shafoni just denotes another distinctive feature. So why the use of these two things? It already said that. You used the word natofa. So why talk about shafoni? So shafchani, sorry. The Gemara therefore offers another interpretation of it. It says, rather, shafchani means that the tree produces much oil. In other words, what it's trying to say is that this is more than just the olives have olive oil dripping off of the fruit. Okay, what it's trying to show is trying to say, hey, when the olives are going to be pressed after they're picked, the oil does not ooze from the olives on their own accord while they're still on the tree, but after it doesn't drip oil from like when it's sitting on the tree, but there's something great about these olives that when you take the olives from this tree and you press them, you get an unusual amount of olive oil. Okay, it's not as much as literally olive oil dripping off the tree while the fruit's still on the tree, but what it's trying to show is show another category that, hey, these are still such good quality fruit that even after you press them, it's not oozing off the tree, but you get a huge amount of oil. So the Gemara is going to ask, and it's going to say, but we learned in the Mishnah, in its productivity means that the tree produces much. So that's going to be a good question. In other words, this Gemara is assuming it produces much, is going to refer to the production of olive oil. So this meaning really can't be shafchani, because the Mishnah already says producing much oil. So how can that be? Okay, so maybe shafchani here doesn't really mean the production of a lot of oil. So the Gemara is going to explain each of the Mishnah's cases. It's going to say, rather, shafchoni means that the tree produces much oil from relatively few olives. And the Sedei Yeshua points out that a shafchani tree whose fruit are going to be olives are going to be exceptionally productive. In other words, when they're pressed, they produce more oil than usual, but we're talking about, hey, there's not a lot of olives here, and for not a lot of olives here, look at how much oil they produced. Okay, it's not the same as having olives that drip olive oil. That's certainly distinctive. And it's not saying, okay, this is an olive tree that produces a lot of oil. What this third category is what the Gemara is trying to say. It's trying to say, hey, no, this is a type of tree that for really just a few olives produces a huge amount of olive oil. And so that's what it's trying to say. Now, this other term, natofa, Gemara says, means that the tree drips oil of its own accord. I have never seen that, but it must exist, and I would love to see an olive tree that drips olive oil. And then when the Mishnahs, talk about the productivity, the Gemara says, in its productivity means it produces much. And the Gemara says this means that it produces many olives. In other words, its olives produce only the usual amount of oil, okay, but it produces a lot of oil, a lot of olives, okay? So it's saying in its productivity, produces much means it produces a lot of oil, a lot of olives. Then you have the natofa, which literally is so rich it drips olive oil while the olives are still on the tree. And the shafchoni is literally going to be that, hey, you have these olives and you press them and it makes a huge amount of oil. All three are going to be distinctive, but in three different ways. And that's what the Gemara is trying to show us. Now, the Mishnah was talking about another term, baishani. And so that's also going to be, distinctive, just like shafchani. Like it's really trying to talk about like busha or something like that, something like a shame, something that's shamed. Okay, and the Gemara is going to explain this term. It says some wish to say that this means that its fruit or it is literally baishani. In other words, dried out, because the fruit is dry, it produces little oil, and the tree is going to be memorable for this reason. In other words, it's a really bad reason. It's not famous for being good, it's famous for being bad. It's so famous, it's infamous, right? That's a joke. But infamy is also something to remember, in that, hey, look, not only does this tree not produce a lot of olives, but the olive oil, it produces so little olive oil when you press it that it's memorable. Okay, that's really what it's saying. That the olives on the tree are dried out, so definitely not like the tofa, and that when you take them, there's not a lot of them, not a lot of olives, and then when you press them, it's a lot less than even a normal olive tree. That is going to be a baishani. In other words, the tree is memorable for its lousiness, okay? And so the Gemara says, others wish to say that baishani connotes embarrassment for this tree. The tree embarrasses its fellow trees by producing. So let me reread that. Okay, so there's another way to read this where this tree can produce more oil than other trees, and there's another way to read it where they're saying that no, you should read baishani as embarrassment, like the tree could be so good that it actually embarrasses the other trees because it becomes memorable. So the Gemara says others wish to say that baishani connotes embarrassment, and this tree embarrasses its fellow trees by producing so much more oil than they. So in other words, this extra production renders it memorable. But that really is interesting because it seems like a shafani, right? So let me take a look at the Tosfot Yom Tov here, and it's going to say that a baishani and a shafani are actually one and the same, and both are extra productive trees. However, in some places, this sort of tree is called a baishani, and in other places, it's called a shafchani. In other words, that it depends on the geography of where you are. In some places, the custom is to call it a shafchani, and in some places, the custom is to call it a baishani. And it's actually the same thing. And the reason that the Mishnah is putting it in there, according to Tosfot Yom Tov, is that hey, this is just talking about different areas in Eretz Yisrael, and it's getting the slang right so that there's no confusion depending on where you are, that it's covering the bases. So that's another way to read this. So the Mishnah was ruling that an unusually productive tree is exempt from the laws of shchicha, and the Gemara records a pair of inquiries regarding this ruling. The first inquiry. So this is now going to be saying, hey, does this mean that a tree is not regarded as distinctive? The Gemara says, unless it produces 4 times as much as an ordinary olive tree. And it continues and it says, as in the ruling taught there in the following Mishnah, if all the sheaves of the field are each the size of 1 kav, and one is the size of 4 kavin, and he forgot the sheaf of 4 kavin, so over there in that Mishnah, Bet Shammai says that this is not shchicha, and Bet Hillel says it is shchicha. So in that Mishnah, the exemption for the large sheaf requires that it to be 4 times the size of the usual olives, and perhaps then the same could be true here, that an extra productive olive tree is not exempt unless it produces 4 times more than an ordinary tree. Maral Fulda is going to explain this for us, and here's what he says. He says, the Gemara is wondering whether our Mishnah's ruling concerning productive trees should be compared to Bet Shammai's ruling concerning an overly large sheaf of grain. On the other hand, our Mishnah might follow the view of Bet Shammai there, in which case a distinctive tree would have to produce 4 times as much as an ordinary tree. Or perhaps the ruling of our Mishnah has nothing in common with that ruling, and in which case it would agree with Bet Hillel that an extra productive olive tree does not need to produce 4 times as much as its fellows. Here's another explanation by the Rosh Cirilio. He says, the Gemara here wonders whether Bet Shammai's reasoning over there in that other Mishnah is also the reasoning behind this Mishnah's ruling regarding an olive tree. If the two rulings are the same, then the extra production on the olive tree is going to be exempt from shchicha, and that is viewed as being composed of several individual trees of a number too great to be subject to shchicha. So according to Bet Shammai, this number is 4. Thus, if our Mishnah follows that view of Bet Shammai, the extra productive tree would need to yield 4 times as much as an ordinary tree. At least somebody's trying to put a limit on it, because you could say, oh, well, maybe it's 5% more productive and I remember it. No, they're trying to say, no, this could be, if it's like Bet Shammai, hey, it has to be at least 4 times as productive. Okay, so Gemara is going to respond to that. And here's what the Gemara reads. It says, once the tree produces more than its fellow, it is regarded as distinctive, and so is exempt from the law of shchicha. So in other words, it's trying to say it does not need to produce 4 times as much as an ordinary tree. It just needs to produce more. So according to this, if you have a tree that produces 5% more, but it's still memorable because it produces more, and you're thinking about olives a lot because you're an olive farmer and you really notice this, then that is going to be exempt from shchicha. It does not need to produce 4 times as much. Here's what the Rosh Cirilio says about this Gemara. In other words, this Gemara now is going to explain that, in fact, an extra productive tree is exempt from shchicha not only because it is legally regarded as being composed of several separate trees, but because its distinctiveness makes it memorable and thus unfit for shchicha. And therefore, it is not necessary for this tree to produce 4 times as much as the ordinary one. So this halacha is going to be like Bet Hillel, not Bet Shammai. Now there's going to be a second question. So the question the Gemara asks is, does the Mishnah mean that unless the trees produce a large amount of fruit or oil every single year, is it not considered a distinctive tree? So, okay, let's see what the Gemara says about that one. The Gemara answers and says, as long as the tree produces lavishly in most years, it is regarded as a distinctive tree. So in other words, the Vilna Goan is gonna explain that this requirement applies to a shafchani and a netofa, where the tree drips olive oil, need only produce an excess amount of oil in the season it is overlooked. And even this achievement was never matched in previous years, the tree is going to be exempt from shchicha. So according to the Vilna Goan, a tree that drips oil is of lesser status than one that has a name in the field, but is still exempt from shchicha because of the large volume of oil it produces. So, since its status derives entirely from its present yield, its production in previous years is unimportant. So, in some cases, says the Vilna Goan, that um, it can be exempt, and depending on which status of the tree it has, whether it's a shafchani or a natofa, then if it produces in most years, it will be exempt, but this other one has to be doing it in this year. So that's another way to look at it. Another way to look at it is literally like what the shot of this Gemara says, where it's saying that as long as the tree produces lavishly in most years, it is regarded as a distinctive tree. The finer point of the Vilna Goan is to make this distinction between the two, the shafchani and the natofa, and say that no, this is a requirement that's only applying to a shafchani, and the natofa is going to have a different status and a different way to measure it. So, and basically, he's going to say for the natofa, it only has to produce an excess of oil in the season it's overlooked. Okay, so that it's just for that year, and so Vilna Gaon is saying that this Gemara is talking about the shafchani. The Mishnah stated, being distinctive in its location means that it stands alongside a wine press or a break in the wall. Notice here, these are two permanent fixed things. These are two things that are fixed to the ground, and that is really an important thing to keep in mind here. It's not a semi-permanent structure. It's really like wired in there. It's really dug in, and it's next to it. So we know that there was a debate between Bet Hillel, Bet Shammai, about what happens if you have sheaves that are next to a semi-permanent structure like an uncemented wall. So semi-permanent structure, that was going to be a malochet, and what saved that malochet over there was that this sheaf was already pulled out to be taken to the city. So everybody agreed that there was no malochet on that part. But what happens is, what's going to be the case when it's by a semi-permanent structure? Here now is talking about a fixed structure. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. And what's coming up in these chapters is that it's always trying to break down memorability by permanent structures, permanent things, and memorability by not permanent things that are movable or semi-fixed. The Gemara asks, the ruling of the Mishnah is in accordance with Bet Shammai, for Bet Shammai says, if one declares his produce ownerless for the poor, only it is deemed ownerless. And then the Mishnah continues and it says, if a sheaf was standing near a wall or a pile of grain or near cattle or farming tools and he forgot to gather it, Bet Shammai says it is not shchicha, and Bet Hillel says it is shchicha. So this is the Mishnah in chapter 6, Halacha 1. And over here, Bet Shammai is holding that somebody who declares his produce ownerless, which is hefker, but he stipulates it that it's available for acquisition only by the poor, has made a legally valid declaration. Bet Hillel holds that it is not a legally valid declaration, and the produce can be acquired by anyone for hefker, and that will not be that will be subject to tithes. By the way, hefker is always subject to tithes. So, in Bet Shammai's case, it will not be subject to tithes because it can only be acquired by the poor. But again, it's going to be by Bet Hillel. And now we're going to get on to talking about this case some more. In this Mishnah, the exemption for the sheaf is on account of its location, and that is the dispute between Bet Shammai, who exempts the sheaf from shchicha, and Bet Hillel, who includes it in the law of shchicha. And it's now going to go to this thing about trees. And The question is now, is this exemption going to follow Bet Shammai? Over there, with this dispute, you have two things here. You could look at the wall in terms of being more permanent, and you could look at the cattle as being less permanent. And so here now it's talking about something that is definitely permanent, like a wine press. So that's something that we have to keep in mind for this. And the Gemara is going to differentiate between the ruling of that Mishnah and this Mishnah. Okay, so Rabbi Yossi says, actually, our Mishnah is in accordance with all opinions, both Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel. In other words, for their disagreement in that Mishnah, chapter 6, halacha 1, it could be explained as follows. So here's how Rabbi Yossi is explaining that Mishnah over there and this dispute. Gemara continues, says, there, the Mishnah discusses the case of an object that is detached from the ground, in other words, movable property, it's a sheaf of grain over there, standing alongside an object that is attached to the ground, a wall. Bet Hillel maintains that a portable item is not regarded as memorable on account of its location and so remains subject to shchicha. Here, however, the Mishnah speaks of an object that is attached to the ground, like a tree, standing alongside an object that is attached to the ground, a wine press. In that case, Bet Hillel agrees that the object's location can render it memorable and therefore exempt from shchicha. Thus, our Mishnah is not necessarily following the view of Bet Shammai. So there's really, in some way, no malochet. In some way, there is. Let's take a look at the lecture notes from Beur from Rabbi Kanievsky. Here's what he says about this. He says that because an item that is not attached to the ground can easily be transported to a different location at a moment's notice, its location does nothing to fix it in a person's mind. Therefore, Bet Hillel's rule that a sheaf of grain standing next to a particular landmark is not memorable, and so remains liable to shchicha. All the more so in the other cases of the earlier Mishnah, in which the unattached sheaf lies near another portable object, another movable object, another semi-permanent object, such as a grain pile or a cow. Bet Hillel agrees that the location of an item that is attached to the ground does render it memorable, as long as a landmark is also attached to the ground. On that, basically, there's no dispute between Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai. Everybody agrees that if you have something that's next to a fixed landmark, that's going to be memorable. Now we're talking about a tree which is fixed next to a wall that is fixed. Both are fixed to the ground. Rabbi Kanievsky continues, says, therefore, they too admit that an olive tree located alongside a press is not subject to the law of shchicha as per the ruling of the Mishnah. So the Gemara is going to explain Rabbi Yossi's ruling. Rabbi Shimon bar ben Yakim says, Rabbi Yossi said this only in the beginning when olive trees were not common, for Hadrian the Wicked came and laid waste to the land. But now that olive trees are common, even Rabbi Yossi would agree that there is shchicha for olive trees. So, according to this interpretation, Rabbi Yossi's ruling was intended only for a particular time of scarcity, and that does not apply for normal times. The Gemara is going to present an alternative explanation of Rabbi Yossi's ruling where it applies to all times. Now, this is going to be explained, I think, by a different Rabbi Yossi. Now, one was Rabbi Yossi the Tana, who was in this Mishnah, and now we're jumping to an Amorah named Rabbi Yossi. Actually, this is going to be an Amorah named Rabbi Yossi bar Zavida. We're going to look at the Vilna Goan's comments on this to help us to explain it. So now we're jumping to another Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi said, no one obligated a person to leave shchicha for olive trees except Rabbi Akiva, for he explains the scriptural terms behind you to teach this obligation. So um, the Rosh Cirilio saying that the term behind you appears in connection with olive trees in the following verse in 24:20, where it says, "When you beat your olive trees, you shall not remove its glory behind you." That term behind you is key. And it appears also in the verse concerning grapevines. It says, "When you harvest your vineyard, you shall not glean behind you." Again, behind you and behind you. So this common wording creates a gezerah shava, in other words, this scriptural analogy that's going to teach a comparison between these two items. Just as the grapevine over here is subject to shchicha, so too should be an olive tree. So the source of shchicha for grapevines is none other than the word behind you here. So that's what Rabbi Yossi here is trying to say. He's trying to say that this phrase alludes to the produce behind the worker, which has already been passed and forgotten. And this verse is teaching that the produce must be treated as shchicha. Now, check out the Bavli in Hulin 131a, and you could check out the Rashi over there. It's basically going to say the same thing. That's how I know this. So you can check out the Rashi over there in 131b for some commentary about this. And basically, this is going to bring up a difficulty because now we have this verse over here about olive trees and over there about vines behind you and behind you. So then why does shchicha of an olive tree have to be derived by means of a gezerah shava for a grapevine? It should be directly derived from the verse about the olive trees. Why do we need to know about the gleaning and not picking up from behind you from the grapevine? So that's really unusual. Rosh Cirilio explains that in the case of the olive tree, the phrase behind you is found in the verse that includes the trees for the law of Peah. And behind you informs us that the Peah must be left over to the end of a tree's harvest when the harvest is behind you. And because the verse is needed for this teaching, it is not available to teach that olive trees are subject to shchicha. By contrast, the verse that states behind you regarding grapevines speaks of the obligation to leave gleanings, oleos, for the poor. Since this obligation has already been taught elsewhere, and we know that from Leviticus 19:10, the phrase behind you is going to be extra. And therefore, he's going to use this to explain this phrase to teach the requirement of shchicha for grapevines. So Rosh Cirilio is pointing out that what this is saying is that the gezerah shava of behind you and behind you is going to extend the law of shchicha further from grapevines to olive trees. So it's going to emerge that, and then we're gonna finish up. So the Gemara says it emerges that according to Rabbi Yossi, there is no shchicha for olive trees at any time, for he does not expound the scriptural term behind you to teach this obligation. So again, this is Rabbi Yosei bar Zavada, the Amara, and he's saying about what Rabbi Yossi the Tana is saying. He's saying that it must be, according to the Amara, that the Tana does not explain the gezerah shava behind you, according to this view. Then there's going to be, if he doesn't do it, then there's going to be no source to include olive trees in the law of shchicha. So the Amara, Rabbi Yossi, is really reading this or interpreting this in a literal way, that Rabbi Yossi the Tana does not hold that olive trees have shchicha, because he's saying that the trees are not subject to this law because the phrase behind you is written regarding olive trees and is used already to teach the law of Peah. Okay, that's the point of that. I want to look at the explanation by the Vilna Goan, because he's going to clear this up so it's really crystal clear for us. Okay, Vilna Goan says that here's how to read this. Okay, that's my own ways to say it. He's offering the following reading. He says, so if so, there should be no shchicha for grapes, according to this Rabbi Yossi. The Gemara reasons that since Rabbi Yossi, the Tana, rejects the teaching with regards to olives, he presumably rejects this teaching with regards to grapevines as well. And accordingly, he should not require shchicha for grapevines. Yet, nowhere do we find that Rabbi Yossi, the Tana, exempts grapes from shchicha. And this would indicate that the Amara, Rabbi Yossi's understanding of the Tana, Rabbi Yossi's ruling, is incorrect. In other words, since the Gemara is not going to respond to this challenge, says the Vilna Goan, it would seem that Rabbi Yosef bar Zivada, the Amara's interpretation, is refuted, and this is evident by the just the way the Gemara works. The Gemara doesn't even respond to it, and so by not responding to it, that's not a statement of, oh, that's what the law is and that's what the halacha is. That's, according to Vilna Goan, a statement that everybody rejects what the Amara, Rabbi Yossi, is saying to interpret it. Okay, this argument is about the way he's reading behind you, and he's basically saying that behind you has already been used for the law of Peah with regards to the olive tree, and so that you need this gezerah shava in order to know this law from the grapevine. And basically, nobody agrees with that, and this is rejected. So, according to this interpretation, the Amara Rabbi Yossi has no source to apply the law of shchicha to olive trees, and therefore rules that that there was never an obligation of shchicha for olive trees. So we know that this can't be right. Okay, so there's something wrong there, and the Gemara doesn't respond to it because it should be obvious. Now, why is it going to be obvious? Because they're going to actually bring up Rabbi Akiva's teaching of it, so that we don't get confused about what this Amara Rabbi Yossi is trying to teach of the Tana Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Akiva is explaining the verse behind you, written regarding grapevines and olives, to teach the law of shchicha for olive trees, and the Gemara is going to challenge this explanation. Okay, the Gemara says they challenged him as follows: behold, there is shchicha for a sheaf of grain, and behold, it is not written with regards to sheaves behind you. From where then does Rabbi Akiva know that the term behind you refers to shchicha? The Gemara is going to answer that. So Mara Fulda points out that Rabbi Akiva derived the shchicha of olive trees through a scriptural analogy between olives and grapevines, regarding both of which the verse says behind you. The Gemara is pointing out that the verse that constitutes the source of the law of shchicha does not mention the phrase. So then how does Rabbi Akiva know to apply the phrase to teach the law of shchicha? So the Gemara answers. It says, since it is written with regards to shchicha of sheaves, where it says, you shall not turn back to take it, says the Gemara, it is as if it is written behind you. That's the reasoning of Rabbi Akiva. It says, basically what he's saying is, because the term behind you is alluded to in the verse concerning sheaves, Rabbi Akiva is deriving the shchicha of olives and olive trees from this phrase. So if you look at Devarim 24:19, and you can see where it's saying, you shall not turn back, implies, says Amara Fulda, that he was in a place once before. Thus, it is as if the verse states, you shall not turn back behind you. So he's saying, Mara Fulda is explaining about Rabbi Akiva's point that there is an oblique reference to this verse in the source view, and it can be used to teach the law of shchicha elsewhere. Very clever by Rabbi Akiva, always cling to Rabbi Akiva. So that's really a deep insight. And according to this Gemara's interpretation of Rabbi Yossi's ruling, Rabbi Yossi is saying that there is never shchicha for olive trees, and the Gemara is going to make an observation based on this view. So Rabbi Yonah stated the following in the Gemara. It says, concerning this olive tree that drips oil and it's distinctive, according to the view of Rabbi Yossi, the Amara, who presented the second interpretation of the Tana Rabbi Yossi's ruling, even if one has already begun to pick the fruit of such a tree, it is as if he had not begun. That is to say, whether or not he has begun to pick the fruit, there's going to be no shchicha for this tree. So let's try to clarify this with the Mara Fulda to get a deeper insight of what Rabbi Yonah's point is. The Gemara is going to point to this ruling of another Mishnah that's coming up, which qualifies the shchicha exemption for an olive tree that drips oil. And the Mishnah states that the exemption applies only where the owner did not actually begin picking the fruit of the tree, where, however, he began picking some of the fruit and then forgot to complete the harvest. Even a distinctive tree, like one that drips olive oil, is subject to the law of shchicha. Now, according to the Gemara's second explanation of the ruling of Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah, shchicha is never practiced in the case of olive trees. And according to this view, the ruling of the Mishnah coming up is going to be irrelevant since there is never a requirement of shchicha for olive trees. So the Gemara therefore observes that according to this interpretation of Rabbi Yossi's view, even a person beginning harvesting of a distinctive tree and then forgets to take its fruit, like that of other olive trees, is not going to be shchicha, right? So according to the Gemara's first interpretation of Rabbi Yossi that was offered by Rabbi Shimon bar Yakim, Rabbi Yossi agrees that olive trees are generally subject to shchicha, and that not only distinctive, memorable trees are exempt, but regular trees can have shchicha. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to exempt them at all from memorable ones, right? Mara Fulda finishes up and says that thus the ruling of the following Mishnah applies to Rabbi Yossi as well, and he too agrees that once the harvest has begun, even an olive tree that drips oil is going to be subject to shchicha. So in other words, really what they're trying to say is they're trying to completely reject this notion of Rabbi Yossi, the Amora's reading of this, okay? And that basically you're saying that, no, Rabbi Akiva had a way to read this. He's saying that regarding the sheaves, he's saying, don't look over here with the grapevine, okay? Mr. Amara, Rabbi Yossi, it's not behind you from the grapevine and behind you from the olive tree. The insight about Rabbi Akiva is saying, since it's regarding shchicha of sheaves, look over there to find the behind you. Behind you for olive trees, yes, but over here for the sheaves, it says, you shall not turn back to take it. And he's saying it's as if behind it there's an extra behind you, as if it's written behind you. And so he's taking this missing but implied behind you in the law of sheaves and applying it to the behind you for the olives to make the gezerah shava. That's the point of Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Yossi, the Amora, completely misses this. He has the gezerah shava all wrong. The gezerah shava is not between the Rabbi Yossi. Is not between the behind you in the olives and the grapes. Okay, we know that we have olives and we have shchicha, because otherwise there would be no point of this Mishnah to say, hey, these good trees are exempted. That's the point of Rabbi Yonah. Rabbi Yonah is saying, well, if you have a tree dripping olive oil, then there's no reason to exempt them because they're all exempt. And that clearly is not the halacha, right? So Rabbi Yossi's gezerah shava is totally shot down here and is totally not the case. And really, the first reading of what Rabbi Yossi the Tana is saying really has to be read according to what Rabbi Shimon bar Yakim is saying, where he's saying, no, Rabbi Yossi is only talking about a time when Hadrian the Wicked came and deforested the land and cut down all the olive trees, and because of the scarcity, it would apply, and that in normal times it doesn't apply. Rabbi Yossi, the Amora here, is saying, hey, I know this from this Gezerah Shava. So all these other halachot can't be right. In other words, the halachot about the Baishani, the trees dripping olive oil, that can't be right. Okay, that's what Rabbi Yosef the Amara in a nutshell is saying, and he gets the Gezerah Shava wrong. What do they do to fix this? What does Rabbi Yochanan, the editor, do to fix this? He pulls out the proof for Rabbi Akiva, how he derived shchicha for a grain of a sheaf of grain in the Torah, and how it's derived in the tradition, to know that behind you is going to refer to shchicha over here for actual grain and apply it to olives. How is that tradition? And it's put in here, and then Rabbi Yonah's point at the end comes to exclude it. Why is this here? Why do they put this in here? What's the point of this puzzle? The answer is you can't make up a Gezerah Shava. Now, the Amarah, Rabbi Yossi, had a tradition from his rabbi, but the other rabbis never heard that Gezerah Shava, never had that tradition. So they're bringing in the other tradition from Rabbi Akiva and from their rabbis on how this Gezerah Shava is derived, so that we know d'oraita that the olives are in fact subject to shchicha. Now, if you were going to read this other way, with this other Gezerah Shava, you might come to think that olive trees would not be subject to shchicha. And certainly, you might make a mistake and say, oh, well, perhaps it's d'Rabbanan, or perhaps it's not subject at all. The case here is saying, no, not only is the olive and the olive trees and these heaps subject to shchicha, but this is d'oraita and it's actually in the scripture, and they bring out the tradition from Rabbi Akiva to show it to us. Now, I just want to point out, in the modern world today, we have a sickness where we have so many people trying to make up their own Torah. Everybody's trying to be a YouTube star and be a commentator. And it's really, you got to be so careful. If you're not really studying Torah and you're not really sticking to the Meforshim, then really, you're off flying in space. And you really have to stick to tradition. You really have to stick to the Haredi interpretation of how this thing is to be looked at and understood, because that is really the correct way. All these other new things, modern Orthodox, conservative, Reform, this is all made up, okay? And it's a waste of time. And all these postmodern readings of the Rambam and trying to make Rambam some sort of modern Orthodox rabbi that was sort of shunned because he was modern Orthodox, it's total nonsense, okay? It's just a total nonsense reading. And you really have to stick to the tradition. Now, this story is put in here by Rabbi Yochanan, the editor, because it's trying to show us, hey, look how important it is to stick to the tradition. And it's really important because you can end up changing the halacha, or have a tradition that ends up changing it in a very different way. And then, we have to guard the laws. We have to guard the ordinances. That's commanded in the Torah. So that's why it's so important to look at the details and try to get it right.